Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History as we look at the women's movement during the Progressive Era. Because despite the feeling that of the late 19th century that the cities were corrupt and wicked, many of the most successful progressives were city dwellers who wanted to improve their own homes. All they were often supported by the rural people, and in truth, many of them were only one generation off the farm themselves. Most were middle class, and their leaders tended to be pretty prosperous. But there were progressives from all levels of society. And many leading progressives were also the wives of prosperous men. Leading progressive women used their husbands' money and their own free time and increasing levels of education to crusade for their favorite causes. Indeed, for a time when it was expected that women would largely stay at home, one of the few socially acceptable things for a middle-class woman to do outside the home was charitable work, and many reform efforts were seen as falling neatly into that category. Some women, such as Jane Addams, devoted their entire lives to the cause of reform. And most progressive women did not attack the notion of separate spheres and different roles for men and women, but instead used that idea to their advantage. If men were the breadwinners, they had to be made to stop spending their income on liquor in the saloons. If women were weaker and in need of protection, then it was necessary to end prostitution for their own protection. If women were naturally more moral than men, then they ought to be able to vote in order to provide some moral guidance to politics. And the temperance movement was a powerful force in both small rural towns and large industrial cities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and had many advocates, some of whom wanted temperance, others complete prohibition. Many Protestant Christians opposed alcohol as an addiction, distracting people from God and from their duties to society, and also as inclining people to immoral behavior. It was seen particularly as a women's issue, as many women opposed alcohol because their husbands drank too much, wasting their family's money and perhaps abusing their wives and children in their drunken rages. Employers of the sort who might become middle-class progressives opposed alcohol because workers who turned up drunk were not very good workers. Others might not show up at all. Lawmen opposed alcohol because it led to disorderly behavior. And many groups were formed to support temperance, including the Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The National American Woman Suffrage Association also supported temperance. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was founded to oppose all alcohol use, although also to oppose tobacco and other drugs, prostitution, bad conditions for the poor, and child labor and other social issues. And they still exist today. Although many important and interesting women were members, the most famous and exciting was Carrie Nation, whose first husband had been an alcoholic who died a few years into their marriage, but whose second husband was a minister, as well as a lawyer and newspaper editor. Carrie Nation described herself as a bulldog running along at the feet of Jesus, barking at what he doesn't like. And what he didn't like was alcohol. Carrie Nation founded a chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in Medicine Lodge, Nebraska in the 1890s. And at first she sang hymns in bars and gave bartenders greetings, such as "Good morning, destroyer of men's souls." However, in 1899 she decided to go further and took a sack of rocks into a saloon and began throwing the rocks through the windows and to the liquor bottles and at the patrons, driving them away. And then she bought an axe and began chopping up bar furniture while singing hymns. And Carrie Nation's a big gal. She's over 6 feet tall, built like a linebacker in a black dress. And she could do a lot of damage. She was arrested many times, even banished from Kansas City, Missouri, but she kept it up, even attracting followers who would smash up saloons and groups while singing and praying. In her retirement, she went on speaking tours and sold signed souvenir hatchets before Social Security provided for the elderly. And eventually the temperance movement convinced local governments, entire states, and finally the United States as a whole to ban the manufacture and sale of alcohol. The 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1919, outlawed the manufacture, transport, and sale of alcohol throughout the United States. And taking leading roles in the temperance movement helped women to gain political experience and experience as activists. Although they had also gained experience in social activism through their involvement in the anti-slavery movement in the mid-1800s, in which many of the early leaders of the women's movement had been involved. But women who did want to improve civil rights had mostly focused on the anti-slavery movement, feeling that being a slave was even worse than being a woman. But after the Civil War, many felt they had been cheated when women did not get the right to vote, even though black men did. Two early leaders of the women's movement were Susan B. Anthony, who would later become the first real woman, as opposed to the allegorical Lady Liberty, to appear on a U.S. coin, the dollar coin from 1979 to 1999, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They worked for women's suffrage throughout their lives. They founded the National Woman's Suffrage Association in 1869. Which later merged with the American Women's Suffrage Association to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA for short. They saw some success. Wyoming, in 1869, became the first place to grant women the right to vote, but by the time Stanton and Anthony died in the very early 20th century, only 4 states in total, all out west, had given women suffrage. But by the early 20th century, more women were going to college. Perhaps 1/3 of college students were women. More were working, and more middle-class women who did not need to work outside the home felt that they were the more moral sex, the nurturing angel of the household, and only women's votes could clean up the cities, and they had a right to vote because public issues reached into people's homes, the private domain of which the woman was in charge. And even working women won a victory in the Supreme Court case of Mueller versus Oregon in 1908, when Kurt Mueller, who owned a laundry, was fined $10 for violating an Oregon law that limited women's working day to 10 hours. He sued, and although the Supreme Court had recently struck down a New York law limiting working hours for bakers, the Supreme Court upheld Oregon's law, saying that because women were weaker and dependent on men's protection, it was appropriate to limit their working day, in particular because long working hours might be dangerous to a pregnant woman, or indeed one who might become pregnant, and therefore the physical well-being of woman becomes an object of public interest and care in order to preserve the strength and vigor of the race. On the other hand, some women's activists viewed this and other laws based on the supposed weakness of women as undermining the cause of full equality in the long run. In 1900, Carrie Chapman Catt was elected president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She served in that role for several years before taking time off to care for her ailing husband, but returned as president following Mr. Catt's death. Her plan as leader of NAWSA was to get women, especially middle and upper class women, to write to their congressmen, to use their education to write newspaper articles and to write letters to influential people, to give public speeches in favor of suffrage, and to use progressive measures like initiatives and referendums to get state-level laws passed granting women suffrage. And these women seeking suffrage came to be known as suffragists, or at least this is the term they preferred for themselves. They were sometimes also known as suffragettes, that being a more feminine, but in the view of some, a more diminutive derivative of the word suffrage, the right to vote. And some suffragists did want to go further than public speaking and letter writing and initiatives and referendums. Among the more radical suffragettes who promoted public protest was Alice Paul, who helped to found the National Woman's Party in 1916 to demand suffrage, particularly targeting President Woodrow Wilson and other conservative Democrats. During World War I, they picketed outside the White House, calling Wilson a tyrant, similar to the German Kaiser, for denying women the right to vote. They described him as a hypocrite, saying World War I was being fought to make the world safe for democracy, but American women did not enjoy democracy at home. Wilson was burned in effigy. Many of these women were arrested and imprisoned, including Alice Paul. And many were treated very badly while in prison. But they were seeing some success. More and more Western states began allowing women to vote and even electing women to public office. In 1916, Jeanette Rankin, a Republican from Montana, became America's first Congresswoman, elected to the House of Representatives 2 years after Montana gave women the franchise. Although some women were opposed to the suffrage movement, these both being images from Britain, where the suffrage movement was even more radical, sometimes even setting off bombs and destroying public property. But some women feared that the suffrage movement was taking women away from their homes and their family, perhaps from other charitable work. Even some progressive women felt it was a distraction from more important issues that women could still campaign for without having to vote for them. Some worried, too, that involvement in politics would make women less feminine, that women would not clean up politics, but that politics would corrupt women. And the women's movement seemed to some indecent, too, when Margaret Sanger began to speak out publicly in favor of birth control, which in many states was illegal and others was very difficult to obtain. A woman had to speak privately to her doctor about it, and many did not even know what to begin asking for. Margaret Sanger argued, though, that birth control would give women more freedom, would protect their health, which would make abortion illegal, dangerous, and in many people's views immoral, less common if women didn't get pregnant in the first place. She particularly hoped to encourage birth control among the poor, the insane, the physically handicapped, the mentally retarded, criminals, and inferior races, hoping through selective breeding to make the human race stronger. The idea of social Darwinism. Again, many people saw birth control as unnatural, immoral, even interfering with God's role in creating life. And for sending information about birth control and even birth control devices through the mail, Margaret Sanger was prosecuted under the Comstock Law, which banned sending obscene materials through the mail. But she continued to do so, even smuggling birth control devices into the United States from Canada. Now, Sanger's legal problems probably did not bother that many people, but the fact that many of these suffragettes who were jailed, particularly those who protested outside the White House during World War I, were sometimes treated very badly, created sympathy for them. Some were beaten. Some were left naked in their jail cells. Some went on hunger strikes and were force-fed by their jailers. And this upset many Americans when they heard about it. Likewise, during World War I, many women went to work in factories, even middle-class women who had never worked before, while men were serving overseas. Many women worked as nurses. Many contributed to different charity causes to support our doughboys in France. And this led many people to feel they had earned the right to vote. And so, in June of 1919, Congress passed what would become the 19th Amendment, banning discrimination in voting based on sex. But 3/4 of states would have to ratify it for it to become part of the Constitution. 36 of 48 states would need to do so, and within a few months, by March of 1920, 35 states had ratified it, a few had rejected it, and among the few who had taken neither side yet was Tennessee, which was considering ratification, as Tennessee did already have a strong women's movement. One of the leaders of Tennessee's women's movement was Ann Dallas Dudley, a Nashville housewife and mother. And she used the traditional image of women as nurturing wives and mothers to promote her cause, saying that if women were given the vote, a woman's home will be the whole world, and her children, all those whose feet are bare, and her sisters, all those who need a helping hand. When a man once told her that only men should be able to vote because men defended their countries by bearing arms, Dudley replied, yes, but women bear armies. Some of Tennessee's suffragettes were more radical. Sue Shelton White, a Tennessean in the National Woman's Party, was imprisoned for 5 days for burning President Wilson in effigy outside the White House. But there was also an anti-suffrage movement, led by a Nashville lawyer named John Vertrees, but supported by a number of women, including Josephine Pearson, who was the head of the Tennessee branch of the National Association opposed to woman suffrage. And she argued that suffrage was a distraction from other reforms and it made women less feminine. So when the time to vote came, it was actually kind of tricky. Tennessee's state legislature only met every other year and was not meeting in 1920. But President Wilson contacted Governor Albert H. Roberts and encouraged him to support the amendment. And finally, he called a special session of the legislature to vote on ratification. The state Senate approved suffrage quickly by a 25-4 vote on August 13, 1920, which put it to the House of Representatives, where the Speaker of the House, Seth Walker, had promised to support suffrage, but then changed his mind and put all his effort into beating it, both in debate and through parliamentary maneuvers and technicalities. Finally, I'm calling for a vote on August 18th, a vote to simply not vote on the amendment. But this did not pass. It tied 48-48. Someone had changed his mind, and the vote to block the resolution failed. So the legislature had to vote on the amendment. And now, another man changed his mind too. Harry Byrne, a Republican from McMinnville, and at 24, the youngest member of the Tennessee House of Representatives, had gotten a telegram from his mother the night before, saying, "Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Capp put the rat in ratification." And though he had tried to vote against holding the vote, when the vote came, he voted for suffrage. So that passed 49-47. Indeed, the Speaker of the House of Representatives now changed sides again and voted for it too, so it would pass with 50 votes in the House of Representatives. Harry Byrne went back home, hired a bodyguard, and hid in his mother's attic, but apparently did not offend the people of McMinn County, who re-elected him later that year. And so women's suffrage was now the law of the land, thanks to Tennessee's ratification of the 19th Amendment. So Tennessee was sometimes called the Perfect 36, because we were the necessary 36th state for ratification. And women were able to cast their vote just a couple months later in the presidential election of 1920, overwhelmingly electing Warren G. Harding, chosen in part because Republicans believed women voters would find him more handsome than the Democratic alternative, proving that women would not necessarily elect the more moral candidate.